So I just found the surgeon who saved my wife's life standing over her in our bedroom at 3 a.m., sliding a portable MRI scanner over her head while she slept. And there's an IV port taped to her arm that wasn't there when we went to sleep. Let me back up and tell you about us, because I need you to understand something before I get into this. Haley was 28 when they found a tumor wrapped around her brainstem, and I spent 6 weeks holding her hand in waiting rooms while she picked out songs for her own funeral. We'd only been married 2 years. I was 29 years old researching hospice care and wondering how I was supposed to live the rest of my life without her. Then Dr. Eric looked at her scans for an hour and told us he could save her when 3 other surgeons said the surgery would kill her. 14 hours later, he walked out soaked in sweat but smiling, and my wife could speak and move and remember my name. We brought him champagne on discharge day. He hugged us like family. I would have done anything for that man. So I'm going to tell you how the person who gave my wife her life back slowly tried to take everything else from her. How gratitude turned into something I didn't recognize until it was almost too late. And how it all led to this moment of him standing over her in the dark, and me realizing exactly what I'm willing to do to protect her. I freeze in the bedroom doorway watching Dr. Eric slide the portable MRI scanner over Haley's sleeping head, and my brain struggles to process what I'm seeing at 3 in the morning. The 4th port taped to her arm catches the hallway light, and I realize this isn't the first time he's been here while we slept. My hand tightens on the doorframe as protective rage floods through the shock. The machine hums softly, its blue display casting weird shadows across his face, and he's moving with the calm efficiency of someone who's done this exact thing before. Haley's breathing is too deep, too steady, like she's been sedated, and that thought makes my stomach drop. I can see medical supplies arranged neatly on our dresser, syringes and vials I don't recognize, equipment that shouldn't exist in our bedroom. Dr. Eric looks up calmly like he expected me to find him eventually, and starts explaining something about monitoring post-surgical brain activity patterns. His voice has that soothing doctor tone, but I'm watching him pack up medical equipment he brought into our bedroom without permission. I move between him and Haley, my heart pounding so hard I can barely hear his words. He's folding up the scanner like this is totally normal, like he hasn't just broken into our house in the middle of the night. I demand to know how many times he's done this, and how he got into our house, my voice rising despite trying to stay calm. He pulls out a key we never gave him, and mentions something about emergency medical access that sounds like complete bullshit. Haley starts stirring from the noise, and I see confusion cross her face as she wakes to find her surgeon standing over our bed. Her eyes are unfocused, struggling to make sense of the scene, and I watch her touch her arm where the IV port is taped. Haley sits up disoriented and touches the IV port on her arm she didn't know was there, and I watch her process the violation in real time. Dr. Eric immediately shifts into reassuring physician mode, explaining he was just conducting routine monitoring for her safety. She looks between us both, clearly torn between trusting the man who saved her life and the wrongness of this situation. Her hand trembles as she peels back the medical tape, and I can see the moment when the reality hits her, when she understands that someone has been doing things to her body while she slept. I think back to 6 weeks before her surgery, when 3 different surgeons told us the tumor wrapped around her brainstem was inoperable, and she had maybe 4 months to live. We spent those weeks in a fog of grief, Haley picking out songs for her funeral playlist while I researched hospice care. I was 29 years old preparing to lose the person I'd planned to spend my life with, feeling helpless and desperate. The memory of those waiting rooms still makes my chest tight, the way we'd hold hands and try not to cry in front of each other, the way every doctor's face looked the same when they explained there was nothing they could do. I remember how Dr. Eric studied her scans for over an hour during that consultation, his brow furrowed in concentration, while we held hands and tried not to hope. He finally looked up and said he could do it, that he'd developed a technique that might work where traditional approaches would fail. The other surgeons had called it impossible, but he saw a path through that no one else could see. His confidence felt like oxygen after weeks of drowning, and I grabbed onto it with both hands. I sat in the surgical waiting room for 14 hours watching the clock and praying to a God I wasn't sure I believed in anymore. Other families came and went while I stayed frozen in that plastic chair, unable to eat or think about anything except Haley's brain exposed on an operating table. When Dr. Eric finally emerged soaked in sweat but smiling, I actually fell to my knees in relief. The linoleum was cold and hard under my knees, but I didn't care. I just needed something solid to hold me up while the weight of terror finally lifted. He told me the surgery went better than he'd hoped, that Haley would wake up able to speak and move and remember everything. I hugged him right there in the hallway, this stranger who'd just given me my wife back when everyone else had given up. We brought him champagne on discharge day, and he embraced us both, saying we were his favorite success story. I meant it when I said I'd do anything for him, when I told him he'd always have a place in our lives, when I promised we'd never forget what he did for us. The first 3 months after surgery felt like a miracle we couldn't quite believe was real, with Haley regaining strength and abilities every week. She started painting again, Something she'd stopped when the tumor caused hand tremors, and I'd find her at the easel crying happy tears. We took slow walks around the neighborhood, celebrating each block she could manage, rebuilding intimacy carefully as her body healed. Every morning I'd wake up and touch her face just to make sure she was still there, still alive, still mine. Dr. Eric called them his victory check-ins when he started visiting our house to monitor her recovery, and we were so grateful for his continued care. He'd beam at every small improvement, documenting her progress with obvious pride in his work. At first it felt special, like we had a personal connection to the surgeon who'd performed a miracle, and we welcomed his attention. His visits started feeling more like inspections than checkups, his fingers tracing the surgical scar with a focus that made my skin crawl. I'd watch him touch her head with this weird mix of pride and ownership, like she was something he'd built rather than a person he'd helped. Haley would smile and thank him for being so careful, so dedicated, while I stood there feeling like I was crazy for seeing something wrong in it. When I tried bringing it up after he left one evening, she got upset and asked why I couldn't just be grateful instead of suspicious. She reminded me that 3 other doctors had given up on her, that he was the only one who believed he could save her life. I backed down because she was right. He had saved her, and maybe I was just being paranoid about a surgeon who cared too much. But the feeling in my gut wouldn't go away, this nagging sense that something was off about how much time he spent with us. His phone calls started coming later and later, sometimes past midnight, always with some urgent question about symptoms or side effects. Haley would answer every time because he'd convinced her that any delay in reporting changes could be dangerous. I'd lie in bed listening to her describe her day in exhaustive detail while he asked follow-up questions that seemed increasingly personal. One night I picked up when he called at 2 a.m, told him it could wait until business hours unless it was a genuine emergency. He got quiet for a second, then said in this cold voice that I didn't understand the complexity of post-surgical monitoring and shouldn't interfere with his patient care. The way he said, his patient, made me want to throw the phone across the room. After that, he started texting Haley directly instead of calling, dozens of messages throughout the day, asking about her meals, her sleep, her mood, her thoughts. She showed me some of them once, laughing about how thorough he was, but I could see they were invasive and weird. Questions about her dreams, about what she was thinking about before bed, about whether she felt different in ways she couldn't quite explain. He was collecting data on her like she was a research subject instead of a person, documenting every detail of her recovery with an intensity that felt obsessive. I started taking screenshots of the message threads, not sure what I was documenting, but knowing I needed some kind of record. The billing statement started showing charges I didn't recognize, medical supplies and procedures we'd never discussed. When I called the hospital billing department to dispute them, they insisted everything had been properly authorized and documented. I asked to see the consent forms, and they sent over paperwork with signatures that looked almost like ours, but not quite right. The loops in the letters were slightly different. The pressure of the pen varied in ways our actual signatures didn't. I compared them to our real signatures on other documents, and the differences were subtle but definitely there. Someone had practiced copying our handwriting well enough to fool a busy hospital administrator, but not well enough to fool me looking closely. I made copies of everything and started a file folder that I hid in my home office, not sure what I was building toward, but knowing I needed proof of something. Haley's headaches came back around 4 months post-surgery, dull aches that would last for hours despite the medication he prescribed. He adjusted her prescriptions constantly, adding new pills and changing dosages based on symptoms that seemed to shift and multiply. She'd take the medications faithfully because he said they were preventing complications, but I noticed she seemed more confused and tired after starting each new prescription. Her personality was changing in ways I couldn't quite pin down, becoming more passive and dependent on his guidance for everything. The woman who used to make decisions confidently now called him to ask if it was okay to go for a walk or try a new restaurant. I watched her independence erode week by week, replaced by this need for his approval and reassurance that felt nothing like the person I'd married. When I suggested maybe the medications were causing side effects rather than helping, she got defensive and said I was undermining her medical care. The argument ended with her in tears saying I didn't understand how scary it was to have survived something that should have killed her. She was right that I couldn't fully understand that fear, but I could see how he was using that fear to control her. His weekend visits became routine, showing up Saturday mornings with coffee and pastries like we were old friends getting together. He'd stay for hours, examining Haley and reviewing her symptoms, while I sat there feeling like an intruder in my own living room. Sometimes he'd suggest I run errands or give them privacy for the examination, and I'd refuse, and watch his jaw tighten with irritation. The physical exams started lasting longer, his hands moving over her head and neck with a slowness that felt more like caressing than medical assessment. I'd clear my throat loudly, and he'd glance at me with this look of annoyance, like I was interrupting something important. Haley never seemed to notice anything inappropriate, trusting him completely because he'd earned that trust by saving her life when no one else could. The monthly MRI scans became mandatory according to him, despite Haley's severe claustrophobia from the initial diagnosis scans. He insisted no other schedule was acceptable for monitoring her unique surgical outcome, dismissing her anxiety as less important than his data collection. She'd come home from these appointments shaking and exhausted, her hands trembling as she changed out of the hospital gown. But he'd call that evening demanding to know her immediate post-scan symptoms, keeping her on the phone while she tried to calm down. I'd watch her pace the kitchen describing phantom sensations and random aches while he took notes on the other end. The scans themselves were clean, showing perfect healing and no tumor regrowth, but he always found something new to monitor or track. When I suggested switching to a local neurologist for routine follow-up care, his reaction was immediate and intense. He insisted no other doctor could possibly understand what he'd done inside Haley's skull or properly interpret her scans. His voice took on an edge I'd never heard before, almost threatening, as he explained that other doctors might miss critical signs only he could recognize. He went on for 20 minutes about the complexity of her case and the unique surgical approach he'd used. I started documenting everything in a private notebook, writing down dates and times of visits, recording phone calls when I could, photographing the medical supply charges. Something felt increasingly wrong, but I couldn't articulate exactly what, and I worried I was being paranoid or ungrateful. Every time I tried to voice concerns, the weight of owing him Haley's life made me question my own judgment. I'd sit in my office late at night reviewing my notes and wondering if I was seeing patterns that weren't really there. Haley began having headaches and dizziness that he said were normal post-surgical adjustments, prescribing medications that seemed to make her more confused and compliant. She'd forget conversations we'd had and lose track of time in ways that didn't match her earlier recovery progress. I wondered if the medications were causing these symptoms rather than treating them, but saying that out loud felt like accusing him of deliberately harming her. I finally told Haley I was uncomfortable with how involved he had become in our daily lives, that his behavior felt inappropriate regardless of what he'd done for us. She got defensive immediately, her face flushing as she asked how I could question the man who saved her life when I'd been ready to give up hope. The argument ended with her crying, and me feeling like a jealous asshole for doubting someone who'd only shown dedication to her care. I tried talking to our primary care doctor about my concerns, carefully explaining the frequency of contact and unauthorized visits without sounding crazy. The doctor looked uncomfortable and suggested that brilliant surgeons sometimes have unconventional approaches to patient care. He reminded me that Eric's success rate was exceptional, and maybe I should trust his expertise, leaving me feeling dismissed and more isolated in my worry. I discovered he was going through a messy divorce around 4 months after Haley's surgery, his wife citing his obsessive work habits and inability to maintain boundaries. The details in the court filings mentioned him bringing work home inappropriately and becoming fixated on specific patients. Reading this should have validated my concerns, but instead I felt guilty for invading his privacy when he was clearly struggling. He started showing up at our house during arguments, somehow knowing when we were having relationship stress. He'd position himself as Haley's protector and confidant, suggesting that my jealousy and control issues were hindering her recovery. Haley would calm down in his presence in ways she wouldn't with me, and I'd watch helplessly as he drove a wedge between us under the guise of medical support. I learned from a hospital administrator that he had been passed over for a department head position despite his surgical brilliance, colleagues citing concerns about his patient relationships. The administrator wouldn't give details, but implied there had been previous complaints about boundary issues that were quietly handled. This information scared me because it meant his behavior with Haley fit a pattern, but also meant the hospital had enabled it by not addressing it properly. Haley's health anxiety resurged around this time, with her constantly worried the tumor was returning despite clear scans. He became her sole source of comfort about these fears, available at any hour to reassure her in ways I apparently couldn't. I'd find them on the phone at 2 a.m, his voice soothing her panic while I stood in the hallway feeling like an outsider in my own marriage. I started sleeping lighter after that argument, waking up at random sounds I couldn't identify. 3 times in 1 week I got out of bed to check the house, finding nothing but feeling like something was wrong. Haley slept through everything, her breathing deep and steady in a way that seemed heavier than normal. I stood in the hallway one night listening to her sleep and wondered if someone was adjusting her medications to keep her under while they visited. The thought made my skin crawl, but I couldn't shake it. I started keeping a notebook by the bed, writing down every time I woke up and what I heard. Footsteps on the porch, a car door closing, the back gate creaking. Nothing I could prove, but patterns that felt too regular to be coincidence. I hired a private investigator 2 weeks later, feeling sick about going behind Haley's back but desperate for answers. The guy's name was Mike, and he had this tired face that said he'd seen everything. I explained the situation in his office while he took notes, watching his expression shift from skeptical to concerned. He said he'd look into it and called me back 4 days later with information that made my stomach drop. 2 previous patients had filed complaints about boundary violations and inappropriate contact. Both cases settled quietly with money and non-disclosure agreements. The pattern was clear as glass once someone laid it out. One woman reported unauthorized home visits and medication changes. Another talked about feeling watched and controlled. Both described the same possessive behavior, the same insistence that only he could properly monitor their care. The hospital had paid them off and buried the complaints rather than investigating. Mike sent me the documentation, and I sat in my car reading it over and over, feeling validated and terrified at the same time. I had proof that his behavior fit a pattern, but nothing concrete showing it was happening to us. Doctor. Eric's visits got more frequent after that, showing up 3 or 4 times a week now. He started calling Haley my patient, in conversations with a tone that sounded like ownership. His hand would rest on her shoulder during examinations, fingers pressing into her skin longer than necessary. I watched him trace the surgical scar on her head with this look of satisfaction, like he was admiring his own artwork. When I finally spoke up and said the touching made me uncomfortable, he acted confused and explained it was standard neurological assessment. He made me feel like I was interfering with legitimate medical care, questioning procedures I didn't understand. Haley defended him immediately, saying I was being oversensitive about normal doctor behavior. But I saw how his fingers lingered near her neck, how he'd lean in close when talking to her, how his eyes followed her around the room. The way he touched her felt wrong in my gut, even if I couldn't articulate exactly why. I found the cameras on a Tuesday afternoon when Haley was at physical therapy. I'd been changing the batteries in our smoke detector and noticed the device felt heavier than it should. I unscrewed the cover and found a tiny camera lens tucked inside, aimed at our bed. My hands started shaking so bad I almost dropped it. I checked every smoke detector in the house and found 2 more cameras. Then I started looking in other places, pulling apart picture frames and finding more devices. 5 cameras total, all positioned to watch Haley. Some were aimed at the bed, others at the bathroom door, one at her side of the closet. He'd been watching us for months, monitoring her even when he wasn't physically here. I sat on the bedroom floor with the cameras laid out in front of me, feeling violated in a way I couldn't fully process. The thought of him watching us sleep, watching intimate moments, studying her like she was his personal research project, made me want to throw up. But I forced myself to put the cameras back exactly where I found them. I needed documentation of his access to our home, proof that would hold up if this went legal. I took photos of each camera's location and serial numbers, then carefully replaced them all. Haley started changing around this time in ways that scared me more than the cameras. She'd ask Dr. Eric's opinion on everything, treating his suggestions like they were medical orders she had to follow. What she should eat for breakfast, whether she should go for a walk, if it was okay to meet friends for coffee. The woman who used to make decisions without hesitation now needed his approval for basic daily activities. She'd call him before doing anything physical, checking if it was safe for her recovery. I watched her independence disappear piece by piece, replaced by this need for constant medical validation. When I suggested she was being overly cautious, she got defensive and said I didn't understand how fragile her recovery was. Dr. Eric had convinced her that her brain was still healing in ways that required his constant monitoring and guidance. She stopped painting because he mentioned that concentration might strain her surgical sight. She quit her book club because he suggested social stimulation could trigger headaches. Every restriction came wrapped in medical concern, and she accepted all of it because she trusted him completely. I called a medical malpractice attorney named Declan Chamberlain, finding his name through online research about doctor misconduct cases. His office was downtown in one of those old buildings with creaky floors and too much wood paneling. I sat across from him and explained everything, watching his face get more serious with each detail. He stopped me twice to ask clarifying questions, taking notes in a leather journal. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and said this was one of the clearest cases of ethics violations he'd seen. He used terms like boundary violations, unauthorized treatment, psychological manipulation, financial exploitation. He said, "Doctor." Eric's behavior crossed into possible criminal conduct, not just medical board territory. Then he warned me that confronting a surgeon with a God complex was dangerous. "These guys don't accept challenges to their authority," he said. "They retaliate hard, and they're good at it." He told me to document everything, keep records of every interaction, save every bill and medical note. He said when we moved against Dr. Eric, I needed to be prepared for him to come at us with everything he had. The consultation lasted 2 hours, and I left feeling both validated and more scared than before. I spent the next 3 weeks building a case, printing out medical records and billing statements. I downloaded the recorded phone calls from my backup files, hours of conversations where Dr. Eric pushed boundaries and made inappropriate demands. I photographed every unauthorized charge on our credit card, every medical supply invoice we never approved. I created a timeline showing how his behavior escalated from caring physician to controlling presence, documenting the progression month by month. The pattern was undeniable once I laid it out systematically. It started with extra follow-up calls and progressed to unauthorized home visits, then to medication changes we didn't consent to, then to the cameras and midnight monitoring. Each violation built on the previous one, testing boundaries and pushing further when we didn't resist. I organized everything in a binder with tabs and dates, building a narrative that anyone could follow. The evidence filled over 200 pages by the time I finished. I found the medical journal articles by accident while researching post-surgical care online. Dr. Eric had published 3 papers about Haley's case in prestigious neurosurgery journals, using her scans and surgical details with only minimal changes to protect identity. He'd presented her as his crowning achievement, showing before and after brain images to demonstrate his innovative technique. The articles included details about her tumor location, the surgical approach, her recovery timeline, all of it laid out for the medical community to study. He'd turned our most vulnerable crisis into his professional showcase without ever asking permission or even telling us it existed. I found presentations he'd given at conferences, PowerPoint slides showing Haley's brain scans to audiences of hundreds. Our private medical nightmare had become his ticket to professional recognition and speaking engagements. I downloaded every article and presentation I could find, adding them to my evidence binder with shaking hands. I discovered the medication manipulation while reviewing pharmacy records I'd requested for the legal case. The prescriptions showed dose changes and new medications that neither Haley nor I had discussed with any doctor. I cross-referenced the dates with her symptom journal and found a clear pattern. Every time Dr. Eric increased or added a medication, Haley's headaches and confusion got worse within days. When he decreased something, her symptoms improved. He was deliberately creating medical problems that required his ongoing treatment and intervention. The headaches weren't post-surgical complications like he claimed. The confusion and memory issues weren't normal recovery challenges. He was manufacturing symptoms to keep her dependent on his care, making her sick in careful ways that looked like they could be related to her surgery. I showed the pharmacy records to a pharmacist friend who looked at the combinations and timing and said this was absolutely intentional. These medications in these doses would cause exactly the symptoms Haley was experiencing. Dr. Eric had turned her into a patient who needed him by poisoning her in subtle, deniable ways. I tried one more time to show Haley the evidence, spreading it all out on the dining room table when she got home from an appointment. Medical records, billing statements, the journal articles, the pharmacy documentation, the timeline I'd built. She stood there looking at it all, her face going pale as she read through the papers. I watched her pick up the articles showing her brain scans published without consent, saw her hands start to shake as she realized the scope of what he'd been doing. For a moment, I thought she was finally seeing it, finally understanding that the man who saved her life had also been violating her in every possible way. But then something shifted in her expression, and she pushed the papers away. She looked at me with this mixture of anger and fear and said I was obsessed, that I'd spent months building a paranoid conspiracy theory about a doctor who only wanted to help her. She said I needed therapy for my inability to move past her medical crisis, that my jealousy of Dr. Eric was destroying our marriage. She accused me of trying to isolate her from the one person who understood her medical needs, of putting her health at risk because I couldn't handle not being the center of her attention anymore. The argument lasted an hour, her voice getting louder and more desperate as I tried to walk her through the evidence. She finally grabbed her purse and keys and said she was staying at her sister's house until I got help for my issues. I stood in the dining room surrounded by all the proof I'd gathered, watching her walk out the door, and realized Dr. Eric's manipulation had worked perfectly. He'd convinced her that my attempts to protect her were actually attacks on her recovery and autonomy. I was completely alone in seeing the truth, and the person I was trying to save thought I was the problem. I printed everything the next morning and put it all in a folder, organizing the pages by date and category so someone could follow the timeline from start to finish. The evidence took up over 200 pages by the time I finished, every violation documented with dates and times and physical proof. I drove to the hospital where Dr. Eric worked, parking in the visitor lot and sitting in my car for 10 minutes trying to calm down enough to walk inside. My hands shook as I gripped the steering wheel, knowing this confrontation would either end the nightmare or make everything worse. I grabbed the folder and headed into the building, asking at the front desk for directions to the neurosurgery offices on the 4th floor. The elevator ride felt too long and too short at the same time, my heart pounding harder with each floor. Dr. Eric's office was at the end of a quiet hallway, his name on a brass plate next to the door, along with all his credentials and awards. I knocked once and walked in without waiting for an answer, finding him at his desk reviewing what looked like surgical scans on his computer. He looked up with that same calm expression, like he'd been expecting me, and gestured to the chair across from his desk. I stayed standing and dropped the folder on his desk, the pages spreading slightly from the impact. I told him I had months of evidence documenting every unauthorized visit, every manipulated medication, every violation of our privacy and Haley's autonomy, and he needed to stop all contact with my wife immediately. He picked up the folder slowly and started flipping through pages, his face showing no surprise or concern as he read through documentation of his own misconduct. When he finally looked up, his expression was almost pitying, like I was a confused child who didn't understand how the world worked. He said he could see I was struggling with caregiver trauma, that watching Haley go through her medical crisis had clearly affected my mental health in ways I hadn't processed. He suggested I was projecting my anxiety onto him because I needed someone to blame for the fear and helplessness I'd felt during her illness. Every word came out smooth and reasonable, reframing my evidence as symptoms of my psychological breakdown rather than proof of his violations. He said jealousy was common among spouses of patients who developed close bonds with their surgeons, that I was probably feeling left out of Haley's recovery process and trying to sabotage her medical care as a result. He even offered to refer me to a therapist colleague who specialized in caregiver burnout and relationship stress after medical trauma. I stood there listening to him twist everything, watching him use his professional authority to make me doubt my own sanity and evidence. He never once acknowledged any wrongdoing, or even seemed to consider that his behavior might be inappropriate. Instead, he made me the problem, the unstable husband who couldn't handle his wife's brush with death and was now manufacturing conspiracy theories about her dedicated surgeon. I grabbed the folder off his desk and told him to stay away from Haley in our home, that if he contacted her or came near us again, I'd take everything to the medical board and police. He just smiled slightly and said he hoped I'd get the help I clearly needed, his tone dripping with condescending concern. I left his office shaking with rage and fear, knowing he'd just given me a preview of how he'd respond to any official complaint. My phone rang before I even made it back to my car, Haley's name flashing on the screen. I answered to hear her voice already raised and angry, demanding to know what I'd just done. Dr. Eric had called her immediately after I left, giving her his version of our confrontation before I could explain my side. He'd told her I'd shown up at his office making wild accusations and threatening him, that I'd brought some folder of so-called evidence proving he was stalking her or poisoning her or something equally insane. He'd expressed concern about my mental state and suggested I might be having some kind of breakdown related to the trauma of her diagnosis and surgery. By the time I pulled into our driveway 20 minutes later, she'd worked herself into a state I'd never seen before. She met me at the door with her arms crossed, her face red from crying and yelling, asking how I could attack the man who saved her life. I tried to show her the evidence folder, but she refused to look at it, saying I'd probably made up half of it anyway in my paranoid state. She said I was trying to isolate her from medical care because I was jealous of her relationship with Dr. Eric, that I couldn't handle not being the center of her attention anymore. Every argument I made got turned around, every piece of evidence dismissed as my obsessive need to create drama where none existed. The gaslighting was so effective that she actually threatened to leave me if I didn't drop what she called my paranoid campaign against her doctor. She said she couldn't stay married to someone who was trying to destroy the person responsible for her being alive, that my behavior was putting her health at risk by interfering with her medical care. I watched my wife defend the man who'd been violating her for months, choosing to believe his lies over my documented proof, and realized how completely he'd manipulated her trust and fear. She packed a bag that night and said she was staying at her sister's house until I agreed to get therapy for my issues and apologized to Dr. Eric for my accusations. I stood in our bedroom watching her throw clothes into a suitcase, feeling like I was losing her all over again, but this time to something I couldn't fight with love or hope or determination. The guest room door closed behind her with a sound that felt permanent, even though she was just on the other side of the wall. She said she needed space from my obsessive behavior and irrational jealousy, that she couldn't be around someone who was attacking her medical team. I heard her moving around in there, probably calling her sister, or maybe even calling Dr. Eric back to tell him she'd handled me. The isolation was complete now, me on one side knowing the truth, and her on the other side believing his lies, with no way to bridge that gap without proof she couldn't dismiss. I sat on our bed in the dark, thinking about how gratitude had become a weapon he wielded against both of us, how the debt we owed him for saving her life had turned into chains he used to control and divide us. Every attempt I made to protect her just pushed her further toward him, made her trust him more and doubt me more, exactly like he'd planned from the beginning. I felt completely alone in seeing what was happening, watching my marriage crack apart under the weight of his manipulation while being powerless to stop it. The person I was trying to save thought I was the danger, and the actual threat had convinced her I was the one she needed protection from. The next morning, I called the attorney back and told him about the confrontation and Haley moving to the guest room. He listened without interrupting, and then said what I already knew, that without video evidence of Dr. Eric's unauthorized visits, it would be my word against a respected surgeon's, and I'd probably lose. He said emotional testimony and circumstantial evidence wouldn't be enough against someone with Dr. Eric's credentials and reputation, that I needed undeniable documentation of him actually violating boundaries and conducting procedures without consent. He walked me through options for installing hidden cameras in our home, explaining how to set up a system that would record automatically without needing me to be present. I felt sick about the idea of surveilling my own house, turning our bedroom into a crime scene waiting to be documented, but I understood it was the only way to prove what was happening. I spent that afternoon researching camera systems online, looking for one small enough to hide but good enough to capture clear footage in low light. I ordered 3 cameras with motion sensors and night vision, paying extra for rush delivery so they'd arrive the next day. The whole time I kept thinking about what it meant that I had to secretly record my own home to protect my wife from her doctor, how twisted everything had become. The cameras arrived in plain boxes that I hid in the garage until Haley left for a therapy appointment Dr. Eric had recommended for her. I installed them quickly, tucking one into the smoke detector above our bed, one in the bookshelf across the room, and one in the hallway outside our bedroom door. Each camera connected to an app on my phone that would alert me to any motion and let me watch live footage from anywhere. I tested the system twice to make sure everything worked, watching myself on the screen as I moved around the bedroom, feeling like a stranger in my own house. The attorney had been clear that I needed footage of Dr. Eric actually conducting procedures, not just entering the house, so I'd have to let him get far enough into whatever he planned to do before intervening. That thought made me feel like I was using Haley as bait, letting her be violated just enough to catch it on camera, but I didn't see any other option. I finished the installation and cleaned up all the packaging, making sure nothing looked different when Haley got home. She barely spoke to me when she walked in, heading straight to the guest room and closing the door. I sat in the living room with my phone in my hand, waiting for the motion alerts I knew would come eventually. 2 nights later, my phone buzzed at 2 a.m. with a motion alert from the bedroom camera. I grabbed it off my nightstand where I'd been keeping it within reach, my heart already pounding before I even opened the app. The live feed showed our bedroom in grainy night vision, and there was Dr. Eric letting himself in through the back door I'd deliberately left unlocked after Haley went to sleep. He moved quietly across the room toward where she slept, carrying what looked like medical equipment in a black bag. I watched him set up the portable MRI scanner next to the bed, the same one I'd found him with before, along with IV supplies and what was probably sedative medication. My hands shook holding the phone as I forced myself to stay in the guest room and let him continue, knowing I needed clear footage of him actually conducting procedures without her consent. Every instinct screamed at me to run in there and stop him, but the attorney's words kept playing in my head about needing undeniable documentation. I watched the screen as Dr. Eric pulled back the covers slightly and located a vein in Haley's arm, inserting an IV port with practiced efficiency. She didn't wake up or move, sleeping too deeply to notice what was happening to her body. He taped the port in place and attached tubing, administering something through the line that made her go even more still. Then he positioned the MRI scanner over her head and started the scan, the equipment humming quietly in the silent house. The cameras captured everything in clear detail, time-stamped and saved automatically to cloud storage where he couldn't delete it. I watched him hover over my sleeping wife for 15 minutes, monitoring the scan results on a tablet he'd brought with him, taking notes about whatever he was seeing in her brain activity. His expression showed complete focus and something that looked almost like pride, like he was admiring his own work rather than violating someone's most basic rights. The footage was undeniable proof of everything I'd been trying to explain, documentation that no one could dismiss or reframe as my paranoid imagination. But getting that proof meant watching my wife be violated in real time, unable to protect her or stop what was happening until I had enough evidence to end it permanently. Every second felt like torture, my rage building with each minute he stood over her, treating her body like his personal property, to monitor and medicate as he pleased. I stood up from the guest room bed and grabbed my phone, pulling up the camera feed to show I was recording everything live. I took 3 deep breaths trying to steady myself, knowing this confrontation would determine everything that came next. The hallway between the guest room and our bedroom had never felt longer, each step taking me closer to the moment I'd been building toward for months. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat, rage and determination mixing into something that felt almost calm. I thought about every violation and manipulation, every time he'd used our gratitude as leverage, every boundary he'd crossed while convincing Haley I was the problem. He'd saved her life, and then spent months trying to own it, treating her recovery as his personal achievement rather than her triumph. The debt we owed him had become a chain he used to keep us trapped in his obsession, unable to move forward or heal because he needed to maintain control over his masterpiece. I reached our bedroom door and pushed it open without knocking, stepping into the scene I'd been watching on my phone seconds before. Dr. Eric stood over Haley exactly like the cameras showed, the MRI scanner positioned over her head and the IV port taped to her arm. She was sleeping deeply from whatever he'd given her, completely unaware of what was being done to her body without consent. His head turned toward me slowly when I entered, and I saw no surprise in his expression, only a calm certainty that he had every right to be there. That look of ownership, like I was the one intruding on his time with his patient, rather than him breaking into our home to conduct unauthorized procedures, made my decision crystal clear about what I was willing to do to end this. I kept my voice steady and low, not wanting to wake Haley until I had control of the situation. I told him to step away from my wife immediately, holding up my phone to show I was recording everything and had been for the past 20 minutes. He opened his mouth to start another explanation about medical necessity and monitoring protocols, his tone already shifting into that patronizing doctor voice. I cut him off before he could get 3 words out and said I had months of evidence documenting his unauthorized access and treatments, that every camera in this house had been recording his violations and saving them to cloud storage he couldn't access or delete. His expression finally shifted from calm certainty to something that looked almost like concern as he realized I'd been building a case the entire time, that this wasn't a confrontation he could talk his way out of with medical jargon and gaslighting. The cameras had captured him inserting the IV, administering sedation, conducting the scan, all of it time-stamped and saved as permanent proof that would stand up in any court or medical board hearing. Dr. Eric's expression shifted when he realized the cameras had caught everything, and his voice took on an edge I hadn't heard before. He mentioned how difficult it would be to find another neurosurgeon who understood Haley's unique case, letting the words hang in the air like a threat. He said most doctors wouldn't know what to look for with her particular surgical outcome, that the way he'd reconstructed her brainstem connections required specialized monitoring. The implication was clear without him stating it directly. If I pushed this, Haley might not get proper care for her condition. He was using her vulnerability as leverage one more time, threatening her health to keep me quiet. I felt anger rise in my chest, but kept my voice steady when I responded. I told him I'd already talked to attorneys and other neurologists, that we had options, and he wasn't as special as he'd convinced himself. His face went hard, and the professional mask slipped completely. He stepped closer and said something I'll remember for the rest of my life. He said he owned that brain, that every neuron firing in her head existed because of his skill. She was his creation, his masterpiece. The possessive delusion was finally visible without any pretense of medical concern covering it. He actually believed he had some kind of ownership over my wife's brain because he'd operated on it. Haley started making sounds from the bed, the sedative wearing off faster than he'd expected. I moved to her immediately and helped her sit up, positioning myself between her and Dr. Eric. She looked confused and groggy, her hand going to the IV port on her arm. I watched horror dawn on her face as she touched it and realized this wasn't a nightmare, but something that had actually happened again. Her eyes moved from the port to Dr. Eric standing there with his equipment, then to me, trying to understand what was going on. Dr. Eric tried one more time to control what she was seeing, speaking directly to her about protecting her from complications I couldn't understand. But something had changed in her expression as she looked at him standing in our bedroom at 3 a.m. with medical equipment spread around. The fog of his manipulation was clearing, and she was finally seeing the truth of what he'd been doing. She told him to get out, her voice shaking but firm. Relief flooded through me hearing her say those words, knowing she was finally on my side instead of defending him. He refused to leave at first, insisting he needed to properly remove the IV and check her vitals after the interrupted scan. I walked to the closet and grabbed the baseball bat I kept there, turning back to face him. I told him he had 30 seconds to get out before I called the police and sent them the video evidence. His professional mask cracked completely, and I saw rage underneath as he grabbed his equipment. He shoved the MRI scanner into its case and yanked the IV supplies off the nightstand, moving toward the bedroom door. I followed him through the house to make sure he actually left, the bat still in my hand. On the front porch, he turned back and delivered his final statement with a calm that was somehow worse than anger. He said I was making a mistake, that Haley's brain needed specialized monitoring only he could provide. When complications came up, and they would, I should remember I chose this. Then he walked to his car and drove away. I locked the door behind him, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the deadbolt. Haley came out of the bedroom wrapped in a blanket, and we held each other in the living room as the sun started coming up. She cried as the full scope of what had been happening finally hit her, how he'd used her fear of the tumor coming back to maintain control. The man who saved her life had spent months treating her body like his personal property to monitor and adjust whenever he wanted. She kept apologizing for not believing me earlier, for defending him when I tried to tell her something was wrong. I just held her and told her it wasn't her fault, that he'd been a professional predator who knew exactly how to exploit vulnerable patients. As soon as the attorney's office opened, I called and sent him all the video evidence from the night before. He watched it while I was on the phone, and I could hear the shock in his voice. He said he was contacting the state medical board immediately to file a formal complaint detailing the boundary violations, unauthorized treatments, and psychological manipulation. He warned me that Dr. Eric would likely try to retaliate and discredit us before the investigation gained momentum, that we should prepare for him to fight back hard. Dr. Eric started calling Haley's phone before noon, leaving voicemail after voicemail. The messages alternated between apologetic and threatening in a way that revealed how unstable he actually was. He claimed he was only trying to provide the best possible care, and we were misunderstanding his dedication. Each message got more intense, his voice becoming more frantic as he talked about how much he'd sacrificed for her recovery. The depth of his obsession was fully visible now, without any professional veneer covering it. We drove to the police station that afternoon and filed a report with Detective Antoine Duncan. He took our statement and reviewed the video evidence on his computer, his expression getting more disturbed as he watched. He said he was opening a criminal investigation immediately for stalking, trespassing, and practicing medicine without consent. He advised us to get a restraining order as soon as possible and consider staying somewhere else temporarily for our safety. The judge signed the restraining order 2 days after we filed the emergency petition. I sat in the courtroom watching him review the video evidence on a laptop, his expression getting harder with each passing minute. He ordered Dr. Eric to stay 500 feet away from us at all times and banned any contact whatsoever, direct or indirect. The medical board got copies of everything that same afternoon. They suspended his license pending their investigation, and the hospital put him on administrative leave before the day ended. Walking out of that courthouse felt like the first full breath I'd taken in months. We packed bags that night and drove to Haley's parents' house 3 hours away. Her mom cried when she saw us, holding Haley for a long time in the driveway. We told them everything over dinner, watching their faces shift from shock to anger to protective concern. They set us up in Haley's old bedroom, and that first night she woke up screaming from a nightmare about Dr. Eric standing over her with the scanner. I held her while she shook, both of us staring at the ceiling until sunrise. Every creak in the house made us jump. Every car passing outside had us checking the windows. The violation had stolen our sense of safety in ways I hadn't fully understood until we were trying to sleep in a room covered in her high school art projects. 2 weeks crawled by while investigations started moving forward. Haley barely slept, dark circles forming under her eyes as the nightmares came every night. She'd wake up feeling phantom IV insertions, touching her arm where the port had been. We started seeing a therapist who specialized in trauma, sitting together on a couch talking about how Dr. Eric had used her fear and my gratitude to drive wedges between us. The therapist helped us see how the manipulation had worked, how he'd positioned himself as the only person who truly understood Haley's medical needs. Haley cried through most of those early sessions, apologizing over and over for not believing me sooner. I just kept telling her it wasn't her fault, that he'd been a professional predator who knew exactly how to exploit vulnerable patients. The medical board investigator called 3 weeks after we filed the complaint. Scarlett Reed had a calm voice that made me feel like someone was finally taking this seriously. She wanted to interview us in person, so we drove back to the city and met her at her office downtown. She recorded everything as we walked through the timeline, showing her the evidence we'd collected and the video from that final night. Scarlett listened without interrupting, taking notes and asking specific questions about dates and times. When we finished, she sat back and told us something that made my stomach drop. 3 other former patients had come forward after hearing about our complaint, all women, all reporting similar patterns of boundary violations and obsessive monitoring after successful surgeries. One had found him in her apartment. Another discovered he'd been accessing her medical records for 2 years after her care ended. The pattern was undeniable across multiple victims, and Scarlett assured us the board was building an airtight case for permanent license revocation. Conrad Maher from the hospital called the next day. He was the administrator overseeing risk management, and his voice carried the careful tone of someone doing damage control. He apologized for the hospital's failure to address earlier complaints about Dr. Eric, admitting they'd quietly settled 2 previous boundary violation cases rather than investigating properly. The hospital had prioritized protecting their star surgeon's reputation over patient safety, and now they were facing liability for enabling his behavior. Conrad offered to cover all of Haley's ongoing neurological care with any specialist she chose, no insurance requirements or cost limits. It felt like blood money, but we accepted because Haley needed proper medical monitoring from someone we could actually trust. We met Dr. Liliana Yoshida the following week at her practice across town. She had excellent credentials and came highly recommended by Scarlett as someone who specialized in complex neurosurgical follow-up care. Liliana reviewed all of Haley's records, including the scans and treatment logs from Dr. Eric's unauthorized visits. Her face went through a range of reactions as she read, from confusion to disbelief to clear horror at what he'd been doing. She looked up at Haley and said the surgical outcome was completely stable, that the tumor removal had been successful and required only routine monitoring every 6 months, not the intensive protocol Dr. Eric had manufactured. Haley started crying with relief, and Liliana reached across the desk to hold her hand. Having a trustworthy medical opinion helped Haley begin separating the legitimate surgery from the violation that came after. Liliana scheduled a baseline scan and blood work, treating Haley with gentle professionalism that reminded us what normal doctor care was supposed to feel like. Detective Duncan called 6 weeks after that terrible night with an update on the criminal investigation. His team had been digging through Dr. Eric's records and found evidence that made the case much bigger than trespassing and stalking. The pharmacy records showed he'd been adjusting Haley's prescriptions without authorization, increasing dosages of medications that caused the confusion and headaches she'd experienced. He'd manufactured symptoms to create ongoing medical necessity for his involvement, essentially making her sick to keep her dependent on his care. Duncan had found similar patterns with the other victims, prescription fraud spanning years. The district attorney decided to file charges for stalking, criminal trespassing, practicing medicine without consent, prescription fraud, and patient abuse. The prosecutor told Duncan they were building a case that could result in significant prison time if it went to trial. 3 months after I found him standing over Haley with that scanner, the medical board held their final hearing. We didn't attend, but Scarlett called us that afternoon with the decision. The board voted to permanently revoke Dr. Eric's medical license based on the documented pattern of boundary violations, unauthorized treatments, and manufactured patient dependency across multiple victims. He could never practice medicine again in any state. The hospital settled with us and the other 3 women 2 weeks later, paying damages and implementing new oversight protocols for monitoring surgeon behavior and patient relationships. They assigned patient advocates to flag concerning patterns and created mandatory reporting requirements for staff who witnessed boundary violations. It felt like too little too late, but at least future patients might have some protection. Dr. Eric's criminal trial was supposed to start in January, but his attorney negotiated a plea deal in December. He pled guilty to reduced charges in exchange for 5 years probation, mandatory psychiatric treatment, and permanent surrender of his medical license. No prison time. The prosecutor called to explain that without physical assault charges, getting a jury to send a respected surgeon to prison was difficult, despite the clear pattern of psychological abuse and medical fraud. I felt rage listening to her justify why the man who'd violated my wife for months would walk free, but Haley just looked exhausted. She said she couldn't handle a trial, couldn't face him in court, and relive everything in front of strangers. The plea deal meant it was over, and that mattered more than vengeance. 6 months after that night, we loaded a moving truck and drove 1,500 miles to a new city neither of us had ever visited. We needed distance from the hospital, from our old house, from every place that reminded us of Dr. Eric's presence in our lives. Haley found a job doing graphic design remotely, and I transferred within my company to a regional office. We rented an apartment in a neighborhood where no one knew our story, where Haley could walk to a coffee shop without wondering if she'd see him. She does video appointments with Liliana every few months for routine monitoring, still getting panic attacks before each one despite knowing the care is legitimate now. We're both in therapy processing the violation, learning to separate gratitude for the surgery that saved her life from the trauma of what he did after. Our relationship is stronger in some ways, forged through the crisis of me protecting her when she couldn't see the danger herself. We learned to trust each other again after months of him manipulating us apart. Haley touches her surgical scar sometimes when she thinks I'm not looking, her fingers tracing the line where he cut into her skull. Her feelings about it are complicated in ways I don't fully understand. That scar represents both the miracle that gave her life back and the violation that followed. She's slowly reclaiming ownership of her own body and health decisions, making medical choices based on her needs rather than fear he manufactured. Last week we got a medical journal in the mail, an article Dr. Eric published about her case before his license was revoked. The title called her surgical outcome a triumph of innovative technique, featuring her brain scans and recovery data without her name, but with enough detail that she recognized herself immediately. He'd turned the most vulnerable moment of our lives into his professional showcase, proof that he'd always seen her as his masterpiece rather than a person. We filed the journal away in a box in the closet and didn't talk about it. We focus instead on building our new life in this unfamiliar city, grateful to be safe but carrying scars that remind us someone can save you and harm you at the same time, that gratitude doesn't erase violation, and that the hardest part of surviving isn't the crisis itself, but learning to trust again after someone weaponizes the fact that they kept you alive.